The Church of Our Fathers by Roland H. Bainton concludes, as we conclude chapter 23, and I'll start this sentence that crosses over again. When I see Mr. Whitefield come up upon the scaffold, he looked almost angelical, a young, slim, slender youth, before some thousands of people, with a bold, undaunted countenance, and my hearing how God was with him everywhere as he came along, it solemnized my mind and put me in a trembling fear before he began to preach, for he looked as if he was clothed with authority from the great God, and a sweet solemnity sat upon his brow, and my hearing him preach gave me a heart wound by God's blessing. Well, being emotionally manipulated by people can be good for good or bad, right? The Lutherans, Catholics, Methodists, and Methodists thus spread, partially because of those who came from abroad, partially by those who were won over here. New religious groups sprang up in this country. The disciples of Christ separated from the Presbyterians because of the belief that if only all the churches would go back to the exact pattern of the New Testament, all churches would be one. Except where there's contradictions, up to 8 different variations of the same teaching that all conflict, you'll find in the book you call the New Testament. And then you'll find other passages that seem to bring weaknesses to some arguments. So the disciples tried to show the way. The Unitarians broke off from the Congregationalists. There were, to be sure, Unitarians already in England, but in this country, the members of the Unitarian churches came out of the Congregational. As the name suggests, the Unitarians believe that God is a unity and not a trinity. They're not willing to call Jesus actually God. They say that he is like God, and we should try to be like him, having his spirit of love, service, and peace. The Unitarians have taken the lead in founding peaceful societies. Now, Islam and Zoroastrianism and others would say you be like God. All these qualities you hear of God, except for the majesty and pride. Maybe that's not quite the way to say them, but my stomach's getting rumbly at the mention of pride. I don't know why. Well, it's time to eat, isn't it? But except for those two, the love, the peace, the knowledge, you try to show these in your own life. So being like God in that respect, but don't think you're like God in essences, or that even the most mighty of humanity in any quality is going to come comparable to God in anything. So a clarity of that. Love, spirit, love, service, and peace. The Unitarians have taken the lead in founding peace societies. The Unitarians and I'm jumbling here. I'm sorry. I'll get right back to it. But the Unitarians and the Catholic Church are leading these peace and justice movements and stuff like this to kind of give them a superior position in the movement. Not that these are not ideas common to all faiths, but there's kind of an undertone to it that's can be problematic. The Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ, the Latter-day Saints, sprang up entirely in this country. They believe that 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, carried away into captivity, came over to South America, and they had a history like that of the 2 tribes in Palestine. Now, there was no Palestine when at that time. Oh, actually, later the Romans called it Palestine to slough off the insult that the Jews had came up with and call the people that. And then the British did it Um, but it's not all the people. It's just just a small group of people. Not that the 10 tribes came over here. So there's to clarify that. The story is told in the Book of Mormon. The church is also called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Some settled in Missouri and some in Utah, while there was a migration to Missouri and then to Utah. And now it's the biggest church in the country, other than like the Catholics. 17 million members? Christian Science also began in America. It teaches that evil and sickness are not real, and if people believe strongly enough in goodness and health, they will not be sick. The Christian Scientist published one of our best newspapers, the Christian Science Monitor. Well, it's worth flipping through at a bus stop, but not paying for. In the early days in America, the church was the center of the community. In the heart of the village was the green, and in the middle of the green was the church. The church, apart from the town meeting, was all that brought together the entire community together. We shall notice how the churches were built and how the Sabbath was kept. Soon would be formed churches that actually talked about keeping the Sabbath rather than this Sunday thing. The church buildings in the colonies were very plain meeting houses, square in shape, with pyramidal roofs, topped by a belfry. The oldest building of this type still standing in the same place and still used for worship is the one at Hingham, Massachusetts, built in 1681. Later churches of the Christopher Wren type were built on this side of the water, but with changes to make them fit Puritan ideas. No cross, only a weathercock was allowed on the spire. Well, some people will say the spire is unbiblical and quote their verses, but the oldest church that I have personally encountered was from the 1700s, although I have encountered graves about 100 years earlier than that. The pulpit, not the altar, was the center of interest, and sometimes, in order to be as different as possible from the Catholic and Episcopal churches, the pulpit was placed in the middle of the long wall with the main door opposite, as in the church in Northampton, Massachusetts. In the course of time, narrow Puritan views passed away, and the pulpit was back at the end of the long way of the building. Now, the pulpit's one thing, but when it comes to the prayers and the rituals, I don't like how the Catholics have switched around to kind of face and do a presentation and translate it sometimes weekly. Of course, the Mass was a composed by clergy thing anyways, but sometimes even composed things that aren't divine have a power in their original languages. On the inside of the churches, the seats were sometimes pews in rows, and sometimes square boxes without a lid, in which children could be heard but not seen. The picture shows a boy and his sister left by themselves in one of these pew boxes. He has misbehaved, and she is lecturing him. That's one of the things my grandmother mentioned, the importance of quizzing and lecturing and correcting people in regards to their church activity. And this was her book, by the way. Sunday was called the Sabbath, and began when the first star appeared on Saturday night and ended with sundown on Sunday. The day was strictly kept. Some children found it tiresome and had to be scoffed by the justice of the peace for the rude and idle behavior in the meeting house, such as smiling and laughing and enticing others to evil. One lad was reproved for throwing Sister Pentecost Perkins on the ice, it being the Sabbath day, that between the meeting houses and his place of abode. But Sunday in all was such a terrible day, and those who grew up, taking it for granted, loved the day for its grave and simple charm. Henry Ward Beecher, a Congregational minister and the son of one Congregational can be congregational assembly, can be said to link to ecclesia and, how Jesus didn't want a church, but, I mean, it links more to the word than church does, was my point. Anyways, how the day was kept when he was a boy. Everything needful was made ready the day before. When Sunday came, everyone walked softly and spoke in a low tone, yet all were cheerful. The cook was blacker than ever, the coffee better, the cream richer, and the broiled chickens juicier and more tender, and the biscuit whiter, and the cornbread more brittle and sweet. Remember, this book was written back in the time where racism and persecution of the blacks was considered acceptable, although some churches had kind of stepped away from that, the one in Christ thing. When the day dawned, all was quiet in town. The saw was ripping away yesterday in the carpenter's shop, and the hammer was noisy enough. Today there is not a sign of life there. The anvil makes no music today. The mill is silent, only the brook continues noisy, and the birds are all singing, larks, robins, blackbirds, orioles, sparrows, and blackbirds, mocking, catbirds, and wrens, singing as on no other day but Sunday, when other sounds are still. Or perhaps that's when they finally pay attention. There was no sound in the village store, either way, not a wagon, not a human being. The smoke rose up soberly and quietly, as if it said, "It's Sunday." The leaves on the great elms hung motionless, glittering in the dew, as if they were waiting for the bell to ring for meeting. And when the first bell rang, the sound rolled over and over and over through the air, twice as far as on weekdays. There was no less than 17 steeples in sight from the belfry, and the sexton said, when the wind was right, he had heard all 7. At meeting time, the empty streets suddenly were filled, but there was no fevered hurry. All blossomed in their best, like a rosebud in June. Do you know that man in the silk hat and new black coat? Probably it is some stranger. No, it is the carpenter who was racing about yesterday with his sleeves rolled up and a dust and business look in his face. And there is the blacksmith. Does he not look every inch a judge now that he is clean washed, dressed, and shaved? Well, shaving is anti-biblical, but we'll leave that. The eyes are as bright as the sparks that fly from his anvil. In the church, all forgot the labors and the cares of the week as they sang the psalms and took comfort in the promises of the God who guarded Israel through the wilderness and had their exiled fathers to the stern and rock-bound coast, where in freedom they might worship him. Well, certainly one of the issues is what your ancestors did. Okay, it's good to remember some things, but you got your own hero deeds to do. The churches have done much for the United States. Without them for many a long year, there would have been no education at all. Public education in the beginning was entirely given by the churches, and religion was taught in the schools. The New England Primer had this verse: "The praises of my tongue I offer to the Lord, that I was taught and learned so young to read his holy word." The separation of church and state meant that the state raised the money for the schools, but did not mean that religion was to be taken out of the teaching. Now, the public schools should probably be evened out tax-wise, not the poor regions get garbage schools and the other ones. But the idea, to this day, 2 presidents ago, we had a president who paid for faith-based initiatives that even included torture of people because they even wanted to follow the biblical prescriptions in terms of eating, but their church didn't believe in that, so they had what the Bible would be considered sins, and they were forced to eat that. And rather than just teaching people the good, railing on them about how bad they are because of their desires and various things, it's and using state money to finance either prayers in the Capitol or, of whatever nature, or various other things, it's obviously an abuse of power to kind of force Christianity, because that's what socially it did 50 years ago across the country. The Civil Rights Act came along, and it didn't quite so much anymore, but the churches founded most of the colleges before the state universities began. And that's why people are upset that colleges are allowing the practice of religions other than Christianity, or even different types of Christianity, is because a lot of these colleges started out by particular churches. Now even the so-called religious colleges can let anybody in and let anybody have freedom of religion, because that's what they're supposed to be doing. Congregationalists founded Harvard, Yale, Williams, Dartmouth, Bowdoin, Amherst, Middlebury, Mount Holyoke, Smith, and Wellesley. All these in the East. In the Middle and Far West, Oberlin and Whitman. Methodists have founded Duke, Emory, Vanderbilt, DePauw, Randolph-Macon, Goucher, Wheaton, Wesleyan in Connecticut, and Wesleyan in Ohio. Lutherans have to their credit Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, Concordia, St. Olaf, and Augsburg in Minnesota, Augustana in Illinois, and Northwestern College in Wisconsin. Presbyterian and Reformed started Princeton, Washington, and Lee, and Rutgers. Episcopalians, William and Mary, and Columbia. Baptist, Vassar, and Brown. Quakers, Bryn-Mawr, Swarthmore, and Haverford. Disciples, Bethany, Hiram, and Drake. Or maybe it's Hiram. The Catholics, Fordham, Notre Dame, and the Catholic University at Washington. And this is by no means all. Most of these colleges are no longer managed by the churches, but the teaching is still touched by religion. And you can particularly see this with BYU and Farms, with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The churches have striven manfully against the evils of our land. One evil was dueling. Men used to think it right to settle their quarrels by fighting with swords or pistols. The killing of Alexander Hamilton by Aaron Burr in this way was a great shock, and stirred the ministers to speak out roundly in favor of settling quarrels by law in the courts instead of by swords or pistols in the fields. Well, the prison system makes the society worse, so there's downsides to that. Another great evil was slavery. Well, so they eventually replaced it by the slavery we have now, of millions of people having been enslaved by corporations to fill prison systems, when the vast majority of the people would not have incurred a physical punishment, or maybe they just would have been whooped and let go instead of going to jail and prison and all that. But generational slavery certainly is an evil. Cheap labor was desired for the cotton plantations in the South. The Indians had been largely killed off. Slave traders, many of them from New England, stirred up wars between the tribes of Negroes in Africa and made slaves of the prisoners, packing them like sardines in the ships to be brought over and sold in America. The Quakers first came to the view that the slave holding is wrong. John Wesley spoke most sharply against the slave trade. The churches stirred up the conscience of the country against the inhumanity of slavery. Well, certainly the slaves were abused left and right, but stirring up wars to gather slaves. Isn't this one of the 4 types of war that's specifically taught by Muhammad that are cursed, is the war to gain slaves? I mean, there may be consequences of war, but that's as a purpose for war. No. When the slaves ran away, the newspapers in the slave-holding states carried pictures urging the slaves be caught and returned. Some church people instead helped them to make good their escape through what is called the Underground Railway, really a string of houses where slaves could lodge and be hidden on their way to the free states. The Civil War was fought largely over slavery. Some of the churches, such as the Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians, were unhappily divided by the war into a southern and northern branch. The Methodists have since come together again. In still another evil was drunkenness. Galatians 5. The Bible doesn't per se condemn alcohol and other drugs, but you better not become an addict. How do you not become an addict with drug use if you, well, very specifically alcohol, but by inference, it's not quite the same as with the Arabic word khamr, the all intoxicant. Islam doesn't have to be specific. It's already got a broad-reaching word that it uses in context. Of course, whatever language you say that in, but Galatians 5 isn't the only place, but there are places in the Bible that encourage drinking. Still another evil was drunkenness, which wasted the money, destroyed the health, and wrecked the family of many a good man. Church people did not at first object to drinking, and even church gatherings were often disorderly through taking too much. A Quaker doctor during the Revolutionary War saw so much of the dreaded effects of liquor that he came out with a tract called Inquiry into the Effects of Ardent Spirits upon the Human Mind and Body. He showed that alcohol is not necessary to heat the body in cold, nor to strengthen it in hot weather. It actually makes things worse. And people who drink to go to sleep are going to have, they're not going to sleep as well. And it's just not a medicine. People say drink with your pills. It makes them stronger. It's like, again, no. In little over half a century, 200,000 copies of the tract were sold, and temperance societies were formed to teach people to be temperate in the use of liquor. Tracts were printed with woodcuts like above, showing the model farm where the bottle is not welcome. And one of the things with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is that they were, and other churches too, they had to deal with persecution because these people were saying, yeah, don't be drinking. And we now find out that even in a weak beer, an ounce of alcohol in a 24-hour period will cause brain damage. One of the noblest works liver too. One of the noblest works of the church has been carrying the news of Jesus and his love to lands that have never heard of him. Just as in the Middle Ages, men like Boniface and Ansgar carried the news to England and Germany, so in our days great hosts of missionaries have gone out to the ends of the earth. Another book, larger than this one, would be needed even to begin to tell the stories of such men as Livingstone in Africa, Carey in India, Judson in Burma, and Schweitzer in Africa. In the 19th and 20th centuries, already Christian churches are firmly grounded in India, Africa, Japan, and China. They have reached the point where their members are able to stand upon their own feet and need the missionary now more as a teacher and friend than as a founder and controller of their churches. Christianity is taking on new forms in the minds of the brown and yellow and black men. And Christ, in their pictures, is shown as one of themselves, and not always as a white man, because Semitic people, even according to the Bible, they're kind of brown skin, black woolly hair, and now the so-called Africa, the phony African American who's never been to Africa, is somebody who's only about a quarter Negro. Well, Negroid, you want to give the subspecies of human. There's more Negroid races than there are Caucasoid or Asiatic. Almost, almost half the races are African races, but the point was that as Semitic people, they weren't as dark as the rest of Africa, but we would have called them black by American standards, is basically my point. But this wanting Christ thing, and so there is some talk that takes it away from that, and the church people were aware of that part of the Bible. The end of this book is not the end of the story. What years to come hold for men upon this earth, no man can tell. If the Spirit of Christ does not win, or the worship of Christ is what they really mean, there may be in a short time but few men left upon this earth. And, that's what they think. Christianity soon will become not a Christian majority. Not a majority anything else yet, but last I saw, 52% of the country was thought to be Christian. You still have another 30% of the country saying Merry Christmas, but that's different. The end of this book is not quite the end of the story. What years to come? There may be in short time, but if men go on, then the church, we hope, will carry forward her work of healing for mankind. Often in the past, she has been sorely tried, and all too often she has sadly failed. But what they consider to be the voice of Jesus has never ceased to recall her to his service. Matthew 7, 22, 23, 20, 21 indicates that it's not about his service, it's about the one who sent Jesus. And there are other passages, and I've talked about why Jesus isn't God according to the Bible. And so shall it be until the end. But if the folly and the crime of men bring the end soon, then will the church uphold her children through faith and that life which conquers death. The words that the little Sarah Bancroft stitched into her sample when our land was new carry us back into the years into which the prophets of Israel, who spoke them centuries before Christ, these same words carry us forward as far as the minds we can reach. They can never fail because they are the word of God. Okay, well, just because we say thus saith the Lord doesn't mean it's necessarily the word of God, but let's see. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with thy God. And it says 1735 was when she made this graven image. Well, it's not entirely graven image, but there's graven images amongst it. But certainly, let's encourage the good and truth of all paths.